Hello, my name's Lesley Atherton, and this is my story called Bluegrass. Felicity rubbed her ageing blue eyes and squinted slightly at the television. What with her deafness and her cataracts, she wasn't even able to distinguish between her favourite soap operas anymore. That was somewhat of a disappointment. They were amongst the few pleasures she still had left in life. At 97 years old, she'd had far more than her fair share of excitement, intrigue and fun, although she had been single and living alone for 67 of those years. The younger Felicity hadn't anticipated this single life, but she'd gradually grown to embrace it. Life had been a pleasure, and sometimes too much of a pleasure. She remembered one particular and peculiar sexual conquest. It was hard to believe just how much energy she'd had back in the day. How time changes people. Yet, ironically, how little people change time, and how bloody infuriating it was to be old. To have lost her identity and become simply an old dear. It was ridiculous that even now, when the proof to the contrary was quite apparent, that people still referred to her as a sweet old thing, or with the suffix, bless her. How that irritated, how that rankled this aged mass of cantankerous personality disorder, how it annoyed this life-loving, wild, old child. Rainmere Nursing Home would have tried the patience of the most patient of their inpatients, she thought, as she got up to make her fourth toilet trip that morning, not owing to a weak bladder, just due to boredom. It was saying something about life's tedium when a bathroom trip was a welcome change. Felicity wasn't unrealistic. She knew that living at the Rainey House involved all the complex procedures and pointless rules you'd expect from any medium-sized institution. The problem came with a few hundred additions on top of those. For example, an A3 orange day-glow poster in the dining area stated, "Residents will be served breakfast in their rooms at 8 o'clock. If residents are not awake at 8 o'clock, breakfast will be missed. It is important to remember discipline and routine are the keystones to a healthy mind and body. Set those alarms, people." Patronising mock friendliness abounded. Another poster, ringing the changes in lime green day-glow this time, demanded that residents must remain in their bedrooms until lunch, served at 12:30. Gentle strolls to the inaptly named morning room were definitely not encouraged. Felicity fervently believed that given the option, the staff would far prefer the residents to remain in their bedrooms until after their evening meal, when they'd be allowed, half an hour in front of the communal telly before early bed. The staff weren't bad. They just found it easier to run the home without the residents getting in the way. And another poster. Whilst in the bedroom during daylight hours, care should be taken not to rely on the television and radio for entertainment. The staff members are happy to provide all residents with craft materials, reading matter, audiobooks and exercise equipment for a small fee. It appeared an excellent recommendation, at first sight, to prevent or slow the putrefaction of minds and bodies, but Felicity remembered her second week inside, as she called it. She'd asked for a set of 5mm knitting needles and some colourful double-knit yarn. She had plans to create a hat to cover her thinning hair. It was one of the very few things she hadn't thought to bring to the home with her, assuming it to be hot and airless, as most of these places were. It was instead an oddly alternating experience of biting cold and intense humid heat. Forever in fear of the elements in the communal areas, the residents often preferred to remain in their rooms, in their beds, hatless, gloveless and entertainmentless. The staff did not complain. Back in week 2 of her stay at Rainmere, the staff had refused Felicity's reasonable request for knitting needles, and justified the refusal by claiming knitting needles were inappropriate. What if they were to be used as weapons? What if they were used by a forgetful old dear to scratch an itchy ear, and an eardrum was punctured by shaking hands? What if some of the more active residents decided to use them in a sword fight? What if? And to allow a resident access to yarn was unthinkable. What if it became knotted? The staff had no time to assist residents in their perpetual detangling. What about drop stitches? Staff did not want residents to feel frustration or stress, and they had no time to assist them with the inevitable and perpetual working back and loop recovery. And what if they used the yarn to tie up their enemies, to tie their doors shut, or to strangle themselves? So no, knitting was definitely discouraged. But the indomitable Felicity Smith made further requests, the next time for a small stash of paper and coloured pencils. How lovely it would be, she thought, to pursue her lifelong love of sketching. The request was denied. Pencils were weapons, and paper was wasteful and expensive. In illustration of this point, she was informed that Bob, one of the male residents, had many years ago been given a craft kit, building the Titanic from matchsticks. It had been immediately removed. It was a hazard. It might depress the residents. Bob might spill, eat, or otherwise misuse the glue, and then where would they be? Other entertainment-related requests were also rejected, with a dazzlingly wide range of pathetic justifications and excuses. So that was it. Mornings were always ridiculously dull, and each one the same as the last. Residents were wakened at 7:20. A breakfast of cold toast, pre-spread with cheap-tasting margarine and insipid jam, was washed down with something that tasted a little bit like tea. It was served at 8 o'clock. The second toilet track of the day was encouraged before the residents, the inmates, the prisoners, were left alone, free and bored for the rest of the morning, awaiting their next substandard meal. Felicity's working life had allowed her to dine in stately homes and elegant restaurants, and she had frequently given restaurant staff instructions for a lightly poached duck egg with black pepper served on the first of the year's spinach, baby leaves if possible, and perhaps with a few snipped chives for flavour. Simple but precise. Quality too. The muck served at Rainmere was torturous for her educated palate. Poor Felicity. To live her last years in such a place was a gross humiliation that she did not deserve. But things had a habit of changing, even in a place like Rainmere. Perhaps she wasn't strong enough to force changes of their ridiculous rules and routines, but certainly there was always room for her tiny rebellions. That morning had started like almost every other. Felicity had woken at 7:20 a.m. to the sound of classic FM on her alarm clock. It had been set to its loudest possible volume and to a station she enjoyed. Nothing too heavy, just a little bit of Mozart in the morning that day. All residents were encouraged to wake in a similar manner and at a similar time, and they did, in the main, following their wakings up with the most immediate switchings on of their televisions. Consider the cacophony of 50 residents with loud alarm clocks and louder televisions, all tuned to the same station, except Felicity's, which remained resolutely off. She didn't bother with television in the morning. It was all a waste of time, she thought, and a waste of brains. Music was what mattered. That morning, after the usual paltry, substandard and barely nutritious breakfast, she made the 10 times daily trip to the toilets, returned to her room, settled herself in her usual armchair, and stared through her usual window. Directly outside the nursing home's windows was a village green, a green fuzzy-edged patch of land, often muddied by wandering ducks and the occasional disallowed football practice of local boys. Felicity had always been quite sporty, and had only given up her daily woodland walks at age 85, so it seemed natural to watch them and the ducks. One of the few positives about being at Rainmere was that her room was positioned at the nursing home's front. The view of the home's back garden, which greeted the rear-facing rooms, was undoubtedly more attractive, but the garden didn't thrive like the green did. It didn't have the same energy, passers-by, young people, or ducks. As she watched, though, Felicity knew that today was somehow different. Her watery eyes were picking something up, not something moving, but something definitely changed from the previous day. It was a misty colour change, and blue had appeared everywhere. The green had turned turquoise blue. She struggled to pull herself away from the seat with window view, and walked as quickly as she was able into the room of her neighbour, Jane, It smelled lovely, not of toast and cheap jam, but was scented with subtle shades of Jane's late husband's aftershave, which she'd sprinkle around the room to give him presence there. Frail and ill, but still bolshy in spirit, Jane was a year older than Felicity, and rarely left her bed now. "Jane," Felicity said, "I'm looking out of your window. Don't get up." Jane didn't. Even from Jane's room, the colours seemed to be the same as from Felicity's. What on earth was that suddenly appearing patch of deep, bright turquoise blue? How beautiful and how mysterious. Felicity knew she had to investigate. It wasn't a case of curiosity as much as it was about the relief of mind-numbing boredom. That was the only interesting or noteworthy thing to have occurred all the time she'd lived there, apart, of course, from the time when the lady who came in with the weekly mobile toiletry shop decided to initiate an impromptu sing-song in the community room, resulting in the death of one resident and the temporary paralysis of another. It was better not to say too much about the short-lived Mary's mobile shop and sing-songs. Jane was still and calm, snuggled but still shivering under her lilac-flowered duvet. Felicity wiped a finger around the edge of the window panes. "Mould," she said, to nobody in particular. Jane was asleep, snoring gently. Felicity was glad. She was fond of Jane and would miss her, but she knew that the end was near for her friend. Age had overwhelmed her, as it eventually would with Felicity too. Pushing that thought away, she looked out properly this time, even pulling back Jane's net curtains. Intrigued, Felicity's mind was made up. She was now determined to do the usually unattainable. To go outside. Alone. Going outside alone was frowned upon. Nobody ever did it. She would be the first, and that was fine. She tingled at the exciting prospect. Perhaps she'd even get caught. How to do it, though? Felicity wasn't sure. The easiest way would involve waiting near the door till the next visitor arrived, to wedge open the door and to sneak out. Something like that had to be worth the try. How could she make it happen, she wondered, without being immediately herded back to her room? Herded was the right word. Herded was how they experienced it. They were like cows, or even more humiliating, sheep, herded and voiceless, but bereft of wool and yarn with which to knit or knot a hat. A disguise was going to be necessary, a very, very cunning disguise, but if she hadn't a disguise, then she'd at least need a method of hiding herself. Either would require some additional effort. Squeezing Jane's upper arm gently before rushing back to her own room, Felicity then took her mobile phone from her pocket. She rang her phone's most commonly used number. "Graham, come and see me tomorrow, would you?" she asked her brother. He was 15 years younger than her and still lived on the outside with a wife and a small collection of fancy mice. She didn't need to say any more, but before saying goodbye she asked him to bring his camera and a few other bits and bobs. She knew he'd be more than happy to help with another of her schemes. The rest of the day was a boring drudge, just like every other day, but Graham had agreed to call round at 11 the next morning. Felicity timed a toilet visit to coincide perfectly, so she could be walking past the front door as he arrived. This wasn't about discovery of facts. Felicity could have asked Graham to check for himself, then report back to her. This was about self-discovery, an adventure, such as it was. You might think that with little to do other than sit, think and reminisce, the inhabitants of Rainmere would frequently moan about their lack of activity and lack of fun. The boredom and the time-slowing, brain-numbing monotony of it all ensured that most did. Some slept, some moaned, some cried, some watched television as if all civilization's wisdoms were held within a 30-minute sitcom or a god-awful magazine-style programme on morning television. But it wasn't like that for Felicity. Her mind, so sharp and active, was continually being let down by her body, particularly those sodding hips. So she had learned to keep busy, mainly in recent years, to drown the pain. That day she'd already spent at least half an hour in gentle exercise, and another hour creating a sketch of a remembered holiday home. 11 o'clock arrived, and Felicity sneaked to the front of the home. The staff, in their emblazoned "It Never Rains at Rainmere" t-shirts, were huddled in the staff room. It certainly was a place they liked to be, and that worked in Felicity's favour today. She was slight and light and easy to miss if the staff were playing their usual pontoon. She sneaked behind the door curtain. The door was a triple width affair with 2 glass side panels, one on each side, being covered with long, dark, miserable drapes. Felicity hid herself behind one and waited. She hadn't noticed before, but the drapes were far too heavy and felt greasy and unwashed, as if the pile was deeply encrusted in the dead skin of thousands of lost residents. She wished Graham would hurry up. Why didn't Rainmere, for all its protestations of loving and caring sunshine and light, use a colour other than deep burgundy for its decor? She wondered momentarily if it might be one of the very worst colours to clean. Imagine spilt milk, yoghurt or vomit on those deep dark surfaces. Surely deep burgundy was one of the most miserable and mood-dampening colours known to man, known to woman too. She hadn't been waiting long, so was shocked when a shape outside the door knocked extremely gently. Only Felicity heard it was that gentle, and that was what was needed. Felicity opened the door, winked at her little brother, then sneaked behind him into the forecourt. "I found the door open," Graham shouted to the staff. "Oh, come on in," Alice shouted back. "It was likely me when I got here half an hour ago. That door doesn't always shut properly." She was right, of course. They all knew it. That said, their eyes returned to their game, and they paid him no attention. Graham, as well as being Felicity's younger brother, was also the home's bookkeeper, and was retired but still active, like his sister. The preferential rates they received were the main reason why Felicity lived here. Graham didn't have his own card key or an access code because he wasn't an employee as such, but he had his own shared office and was around regularly enough to arouse no suspicion at all. And this was important because escape was never going to be easy here. You see, Felicity had known that if she'd simply opened the door and sneaked out, the secondary entrance bell would have sounded as the door shut behind her. It would give her a few moments of exploration time, but not enough before she'd be caught and brought back inside, with a reprimand and a threat of no pudding. This way, with good old Graham's help, she was able to sneak out while he sneaked in as cover. It had been quite a clever plan, on more than one level. Frequently, when Graham visited, he'd close the door to Felicity's room, as they often discussed personal family affairs. The presence of Graham and the closure of Felicity's door granted her more time still. It was still risky, though. Most of the resident windows that looked over the front of Rainmere were positioned so a resident could see both the green and the pond, and that meant they could see her. She knew, as well as anyone did, that certain of those residents would be more than happy to report a troublesome deserter in order to gain favour with the staff. That was why Graham, in his infinite patience, had gone ahead with Felicity's instructions and left his car parked up close to the entrance, with the back door open. She crept to it. Behind smoky glass on the car's mahogany leather back seat was a bag with contents as Felicity had requested. Inside the car she changed as quickly as an old and genteel lady was able to, and as soon as she was dressed, she stepped out. With hard hat and high-vis jacket, work pants and black boots, she looked like a tiny, effeminate outdoors worker. Perhaps a bit too extreme for a gardener, but the hard hat was the best Graham could find her for disguise. Nobody would ask any questions. In fact, nobody would pay her any mind at all. She was thankful that Graham had omitted the steel toe-capped boots she'd originally asked for, and instead brought her his old lightweight walking boots. Still, she was unable to fasten the damn things, and wished she had suggested his wife come to help too. As backseat dresser and shoe fastener, she could have helped Felicity complete the job far more quickly. Not to worry, she was ready now, dressed and done and dusted. It had taken the wind out of her, but excitement and adrenaline had added their share of energy boosts, thank goodness. She had to go look at that mysterious blue-green grass patch while she still had the chance. But now that she was out and about as a temporary escapee, she felt her nervousness kick in. She wasn't scared, for there was nothing to be frightened of, but was certainly apprehensive. How she wished, just for a moment, that she'd allowed Graham to investigate the colour shift himself. That suggestion had all the elements of sense about it, but one aspect of it jarred with Felicity. She wouldn't have been involved. For months now she'd been hoping for something different, something exciting, something to get the blood rushing round her body, and she wasn't going to pass up this opportunity, no matter how nervous she'd become. She clutched the camera that Graham had brought. Who knew what she'd need to record? From where she stood, the lawn on the village green looked disappointingly normal. Disappointing was an understatement. She was gutted, but it wouldn't stop her, not now. She consoled herself by concluding that the lack of colour was probably just down to her position and the way the light fell. She moved forward a few feet, and the light, squelchy ground sucked her under a little. The shoes being unfastened and 3 sizes too big hadn't helped either, and there was also the added element of fear slowing her down. She couldn't stay out long, so had to keep walking. Felicity looked at the windows and counted them. If she walked alongside the windows till she arrived at her own, the 8th along, surely it would be obvious where the patch was. She did just that, dodging out of sight of all her neighbours, despite hip pain and knowing that she would pay the price for it later. She couldn't see in, but as she passed each one, she heard either some Radio Lancashire presenter, inane and bubbly, talking to some irritating local about some boring old crap, or else she heard the late morning telly. She'd rather be out than in, much rather. It didn't matter if Felicity got into trouble as a result of her adventure. What mattered was the mission and the fact that it provided escape from the muffled din of 40 tellies and radios. Anyway, it was wonderful to be on the outside. The only outside she really experienced nowadays was the back garden. Yes, of course, it was lovely, and each plant was planted, donated, nurtured or pruned by one or other of the residents. Those same residents had fought for the lawn to be turned over to shrubs and bulbs, and for the flower beds to be converted to high-rise raised beds, enabling easy access for growing sweet peas and pretty things. But Felicity found gardening dull, whereas this was exciting and forbidden, like receiving a passionate kiss from someone else's bridegroom. Once she got used to it, Felicity realised just how much she liked it out in the real open air. Sure, it wasn't Mount Snowdon, and was just a boring flat village green, and she was less than 100 metres from the home's front door, but she liked it all the same. As she neared her own window, she recognised her mini artist's easel on the ledge. She stopped and took some steps nearer the blue patch, then turned towards the green, looking up properly for the first time. How stupid she felt. She was a fantasist, a stupid, irrational, ridiculous old woman with failing eyesight and a brain to match. The grass had not changed colour, not at all. It had simply been seeded, either intentionally or accidentally, with hundreds and hundreds of tiny purple, blue and turquoise white pansies. She could see now, as all the flowers turned their faces to the sun, with a shimmering, translucent sheen on their tiny petals. She could have cried, but she didn't. She scrunched up her face and walked towards the tiny pansies. She was there to investigate, and investigate she would. Her shaking fingers instructed Graham's camera to take shot after shot of the blue patch and of some of the individual flowers. That was better. The tears were pointless. After all, why should she be disappointed about finding something so beautiful? What had she expected? A blue-green bronze statue buried just under the grass surface? A dangerous and highly localised chemical spill? A complex mystery to solve? She'd fancied herself as a bit of a Jane Marple, but no, that kind of adventure wasn't what happened in real life, to real people, in real nursing homes. She reached down and, despite her pain, managed to uproot one of the prettiest plants. She put it in her pocket and headed back to the entrance, straight across the green this time. Reaching Graham's car, she used the car phone to ring his mobile and tell him she was nearly ready. Once she'd undressed, she walked back towards the entrance door. Graham had been hovering and rushed to the door. "I'm just seeing him out," Felicity said sweetly, as she arrived at the doorway, immediately turning her body to give the impression she was facing out instead of coming in. If any of the staff noticed she was flushed and tired, they didn't say anything. They were playing gin rummy, calming down in preparation for the bedlam that was lunchtime. "What did you find?" whispered Graham. "You didn't take all that long." "No, I didn't," she replied. "Just flowers. That's all it was, just flowers." "Ah," he said, "flowers." She handed him the camera. There wasn't much point saying or doing anything more. He'd print out the photographs and bring them to her the following day. Perhaps he'd put one of the better ones in a frame. Graham kissed Felicity on the forehead. "See you tomorrow, Fliss." "Thanks, Gray." Hobbling back to her room, for the large and heavy boots had been quite a challenge to her long, underused calf muscles, Felicity felt exhausted and disappointed. Well, she was, until she reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out the tiny rooted pansy she'd removed from the grassy patch. Its petals were greeny blue with lilac tips, and they were exquisite. She got up again and slowly walked, opening the door to the garden. "Jean," she called, holding up the plant, treating it with the reverence of an ancient relic. "Is there room for a little one?"